All right. I think we will get started. So welcome, everybody. I'm Shiloh Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of the James Madison Program here at Princeton. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 2024 Antonin Scalia Constitution Day lecture. If you're not familiar with the Madison Program, we explore enduring questions of American constitutional law, Western political thought, and I highly encourage you, if you're interested, to visit our website at jmp.princeton.edu. Follow us on Twitter, other social media. You should sign up for our newsletter, which will have all of these events in it, in addition to other interesting goings-on in the program. We have an extraordinary podcast on which our lecturer today just recorded an episode and will appear soon. So you should go listen to that once it's live, and all the other episodes that are there that are all wonderful. And keep watch for our upcoming events. I'm really happy, delighted in fact, to welcome our guest lecturer today, Professor Julia Mahoney. She is the John S. Battle Professor of Law and the Joseph C. Carter Jr. Research Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she teaches courses in constitutional law and property law. I like very much that you're the battle professor, I have to say. That's very suitable for a lawyer in particular. All right. Her recent scholarship includes articles on government takings of property, the classical legal tradition in education, and feminism and common good constitutionalism. A graduate of Yale Law School, Professor Mahoney is a member of the American Law Institute and serves on the board of advisors of the new Civil Liberties Alliance. Her lecture today is titled Government Corruption and Private Power. It examines how the Constitution does and does not inhibit the powerful few from undermining the common good. Among the current constitutional controversies she will discuss are government pressure on social media companies to censor content, the scope of the administrative state, campaign finance regulation, and occupational freedom. I should say also that our lecture this afternoon, we are very happy that it's co-sponsored by the Jack Miller Center and also Princeton University's public lectures. And it's supported by the Department of Politics Boughton Law Lecture Fund. Please join me in welcoming Julia Mahoney.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thanks very much to the James Madison Program in American Ideals at Institutions for hosting this event, to the Jack Miller Center and the Princeton Lectures Foundation for their sponsorship. It is a great honor, of course, to deliver the 2024 Antonin Scalia Constitution Day lecture, and my subject is government corruption and private power. I'll plan to speak until roughly 5:30-ish because I want to allow for plenty of time for questions and comments. I'll begin by describing how the founders of the United States were gravely concerned about, indeed obsessed with, the dangers of corruption, a term that was used broadly to denote not just bribery and other forms of standard quid pro quo exchange, where it's obviously illicit. Someone is taking bribes to do something that they're not supposed to do. Someone is purchasing property from the state at a low price. That kind of corruption is often referred to as venal corruption. It has been a problem throughout American history. It remains a problem now, although America, as we will be discussing, has tended to have far less of that than most places. And I am not going to completely ignore venal corruption. It will come up from time to time. However, the kind of corruption that I am most concerned with today is so-called systematic corruption, the use of government power to promote private interests at the expense of the common good. I'll detail how the founding generation, determined to escape what it saw as the rot of the old world order, undertook to build a new nation, one that would grow and flourish under a constitution designed, in the words of the Constitution's own preamble, to promote the general welfare, as well as to, of course, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This was and is no easy task. In the initial half-century or so after the Constitution's ratification, many of the most ferocious controversies that raged in the United States revolved around accusations of actual or potential corruption. Over time, interestingly, as I will detail, concerns about systemic or systematic corruption, as it is often called, abated. It is not, I emphasize, that anyone has ever thought that problems of corruption had been, or ever frankly can be, completely solved. Far from it. However, the governance framework put in place by the Constitution came to be seen, and looking out at all of you, I would say some of you, perhaps most of you, spent a good part of your lives in a world when the United States constitutional order was seen as one that could deliver honest, effective government. Not perfect, but predictable, such that it was a shock to look at what government was doing and think that maybe the fix is in, maybe private interests are in effect running the show. Not that there wasn't concern about capture of agencies by regulated entities and so on and so forth. Of course there was, and I'll have some to say about that. But the overall tenor was we are living in a society where we have a constitutional order that is actually able to deliver effective, honest government. Consider the United States in 1950 to 1960, roughly. The United States had not just come through the Great Depression and its economic devastation and fought and won the Second World War. The United States had emerged from these twin crises of economic catastrophe and worldwide mayhem stronger. The United States had become the world's dominant superpower and a cynosure of democracy. Not surprisingly, when we look back at, say, the start, maybe the third quarter of the 20th century, roughly, the United States appeared to be healthy, robust, with a body politic that held the promise of continual improvement. Again, not perfect. The United States was, of course, still marred by racial and other forms of discrimination. There were concerns about how well the United States crafted and executed immigration policy, and so on. There were concerns always about the balance between public order and liberty. I would never want to portray the United States at any point in its history as some kind of nirvana without problems. But it did appear to be in excellent condition and improving. And public confidence in American institutions ran extremely high. Doing research for this talk, I was looking at figures from Gallup, from Pew, from many other reputable pollsters and those who study public opinion, and it is just staggering to me, at least from the vantage point of 2024, just how high trust was and approval of all our institutions. Not just government, though government approval was extremely high, but other institutions too. So government at all levels, federal, state, and local, major corporations and small businesses, charitable and other nonprofits, including, you may laugh, higher education having, as of 2024, fallen about as precipitously. All institutions have declined in public confidence, but higher education has the dubious distinction of having suffered, I think, the most precipitous fall. And I wish I could say I thought it was undeserved, but sadly I do not. So, as of the third quarter of the 20th century, fears, the idea that corruption, particularly the kind of systematic corruption I've been discussing, could prove the nation's undoing, those kinds of fears were a distant memory In fact, I think it's fair to say that many people barely knew about them. Oh, there was some very distinguished, sophisticated historical work, including by Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood. Many of you will have probably read some works by these historians at some point, who discussed the concerns about corruption at the time of the founding era, which I will be detailing. But it wasn't part of, I would argue anyway, America's collective memory, that there had ever been a chance that the United States would have the same kinds of corruption that has been the norm in most of the world, in a lot of the world. That is, so far as we can tell from the scant historical record, I wish we knew a lot more about human history, but so far as we can tell, the United States truly has been exceptional. How things have changed. In 2024, there are deeply troubling, to me, indications that the American people face serious concerns that corruption, in its broad definition, now is an actual threat to the nation's well-being. Now, I net out optimistic about the United States for reasons that I will explain. So I am certainly not here to tell you we are on the verge of catastrophe or that the United States could collapse because of corruption. But we are in a time when the ideas that things are going badly does not seem to be incomprehensible. And it is not surprising, to me at least, that in the 21st century, we have seen on both the left and the right the emergence of populist movements. And even those who would not identify with the Tea Party or Occupy or many of the other populist and populist-adjacent movements are not dismissive of their concerns. The system is rigged, the common theme goes, rigged by the rich, the powerful, the well-connected, the hyper-well-educated. They have, in effect, behaved in such a way, aided by the government, which they go in and out of, such that now the government can't be trusted to serve the public good. In addition, as I just mentioned, trust in institutions has fallen and continues to fall. So trust in institutions falling across the board, a lot of rhetoric, some of it may sound unhinged, but you know, the rhetoric of the founding era was often unhinged. I always have to try to remind people. A lot of the rhetoric is very strong, but it may be very strong because, well, people may be exaggerating the dangers. But sometimes rhetoric is extremely strong because people care a lot. And one thing that I think the United States has going for it is that so many people care so much about whether or not we go forward to an even better future than the United States has heretofore had. But meanwhile, we hear the common complaint, and again, many people are sympathetic, even ones who are not themselves disposed to join populist movements, that the government doesn't work for the people. The government works when it works at all for the elites. Moreover, crises, and we have had a lot of crises in the 21st century. Indeed, some say we are now living in an era of permacrisis, a newly coined term to describe one crisis after another. It seems that we never come out of crisis, and some minds are, not surprisingly, suspicious. Once the United States, when it came through crisis, emerged stronger. The Civil War was followed by the Reconstruction Amendments, by extraordinary expansions of the franchise. Again, not that it was a perfect era, but the United States could make the claim that it had suffered a terrible, terrible, deadly civil war. But unlike many other nations that suffer civil wars, we pulled it together after the Civil War. It wasn't the end. It wasn't of the nation. It wasn't the beginning of the decline. It was the foundation for a stronger nation. The same might be said of the Great Depression. That is, I think, a bit more controversial about what the long-term effects of the New Deal policies were. It may well be that they extended the Great Depression, but even if they extended the Great Depression, they did give a lot of Americans a real sense of optimism, a real sense of hope. So from that perspective, we might say that America emerged in a stronger state after the Great Depression. in part because there was, the nation did not despair. And as for World War II, yes, we suffered terrible, terrible casualties. We would never want to forget our war dead, but the United States was an extraordinarily strong nation after World War II. Crisis, for the United States at least, has been a forge for a stronger nation. But that doesn't seem to be true in the 21st century. We suffer crisis after crisis after crisis, 9/11, followed by invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, so-called forever wars, other various efforts to pursue our interests, bring peace, etc., defuse terrorism in the Middle East and other places. We have taken on a role as the global policeman, spent a lot of resources and so on, and all of that looks not strengthening at this point, but potentially weakening. The same with the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. We avoided a second Great Depression or so, we are told, but we did have a very sharp recession that led to a soaring unemployment rate and then an extremely slow recovery. And the suspicion is that the measures taken to combat the financial crisis may have been unnecessary, or even if necessary, have been structured in such a way that it just so happens that the big financial elites do well. Well, it was the ordinary people who suffered from collapses of housing prices, suffered from terrible unemployment, and so forth. And finally, of course, we have had COVID-19. The effects of COVID-19, we are still parsing through. Certainly, there were some successes. If we think of COVID-19 as a stress test for our nation's institutions, we might say our biomedical innovation complex looks quite good. But there seems to have been, in the eyes of a lot of the population, a lot of failure on the part of government and other institutions. So crisis after crisis after crisis, and we don't look stronger, we look weaker. These are serious charges. They confront us, I believe, with the tough question of whether our constitutional order is up to the task of tackling 21st century problems. There are many, including a number of distinguished academics, including a number of friends of mine, who will argue the answer is no, that the United States Constitution is obsolete. It's not fit for purpose. A bunch of dead men, white men, who put together something and we really should put it on the ash heap of history where it belongs. Now, as I will explain, I don't agree with that. I think the answer is yes, that I think our constitutional order is indeed up to the task of tackling 21st century problems, though I will admit that success, I believe, is not guaranteed. So to better understand how we got where we are, as well as where we might be able to go from here, let's go back to the founding era and think about the colonies that were to become the United States of America. By the early 1770s, the British Empire's North American colonies had achieved a level of extraordinary economic prosperity, a level of prosperity so high that it have been unequaled in human history to that time. Again, the historical record is sparse. But in the estimation of a number of very serious economic historians, the inhabitants of the so-called nation to be enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world. This is not to assert, of course, that everyone was flourishing. About a fifth of the estimated non-Native American U.S. population of roughly 2.7 million in 1780 were held in bondage, were enslaved. Most Native Americans lived in a state of precariousness with limited and insecure property rights. But the point is a very important and strong one, that by the standards of its time, America was very rich and, yes, very equal. Again, by late 18th century standards. And with the United States' rapidly growing population and extremely high literacy rates, it had the future United States, I should say, with its expanding population and high literacy rates, it had every expectation of becoming even richer. But for all the wealth of the American colonies, dissatisfaction among the colonists was at a fever pitch by the early 1770s. Why? They were rich, they were well educated, they were literate, They were very good at innovation. So why, with these incredible prospects, do we read again and again and again in the founding era literature about dangers of corruption, tyranny? And they really meant it. This wasn't just people mouthing off on cable news. They were serious arguments, very, very serious arguments. American colonists were increasingly convinced that their rulers, British rulers, were determined to reduce them to a state of servility and dependency through what the Declaration of Independence was to characterize as a long train of abuses and usurpations. Now, this long list, it's a very long list. It includes that the king has refused his assent to laws wholesome and necessary for the public good, includes complaints, of course, about the quartering of large numbers of armed troops, and on and on and on. Those of you who remember that the Declaration of Independence, frankly, probably the bulk of its text is a list of complaints. And all these complaints add up to one inescapable conclusion, that this long train of abuses and usurpations is designed to establish tyranny over the American colonies. We had better move now, many of the arguments went, particularly in the pamphlets. We had better move now if we are to preserve our all-important freedoms. Writings of the time, particularly pamphlets, are replete with admonitions about the encroaching nature of power and the profound danger that rulers will deviate from their duties to promote the common good. We also see lots of arguments along these lines in the sermons. Sermons were a powerful force for disseminating the message to Americans that venality and corruption could prove most fatal, in the words of one preached in 1770, most fatal to a free state. Now, the founding generation was certainly concerned with venal corruption, what I will call venal corruption, the bribes, etc., the kind of standard corruption. But most of its energies was devoted to what I will call systematic or systemic corruption, a term used by many economic historians too. This systematic or systemic corruption results from government officials and their allies serving as gatekeepers so as to use public power to ration access to valuable economic and social opportunities. As economic historian John Joseph Wallace explains, quote, "In the late 18th and early 19th century, Americans were fixated on systematic corruption as the nation's primary political problem. In polities plagued with systematic corruption, as Wallace explains, a group of politicians and their allies deliberately create what economists call rents, in effect, deliberately fill the trough with stuff that might be distributed later to favored parties. And they do this by limiting entry into valuable activities, particularly valuable economic activities, through grants of monopoly, restrictive corporate charters, tariffs, quotas, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of ways to, in effect, create these potential benefits, which then the government distributes. In the run-up to the American Revolution, as John Joseph Wallace recounts, political thinkers worried a great deal that the king and his ministers were manipulating grants of government privilege, of economic privilege in particular, in order to secure political support for a corrupt and unconstitutional usurpation of government powers, thus eroding balanced government, including, very importantly, checks on the crown. Now, in the founding era, and well into the mid-19th century, these special privileges often took the form of grants of special corporate charters, including ones that had the effect of securing monopolies for favorites of government decision-makers. To be clear, in no way during the founding era were corporations ever regarded as inherently toxic, not at all. Governments granted corporate charters for many forms of organization, including for-profit enterprises particularly those charged with the construction of major infrastructure projects. Think about bridges and canals. Charters were also granted to municipalities, to churches, and to colleges and other nonprofit entities. In short, the corporate form, with its limitations on liability for investors and other benefits, was a welcome innovation, and all were aware that this innovative form was a meteor, or was helping to fuel the meteoric economic growth that was making America so rich. And the corporate form was also extremely helpful for the formation of the civil society institutions, the associations that Alexis de Tocqueville, when he visits the United States in the early 19th century, is so impressed by. We're a nation of associations, a nation of joiners. One can, of course, have all manner of civic, charitable, etc. institutions without having the corporate form. One can be a charitable trust, one can just have an unincorporated association. But the corporate form was a very, very useful vehicle, and everyone understood this. But the specter of systematic corruption came because these special privileges granted by particular legislation, that is, each corporation was in effect the subject of its own law, it was well understood that this granting of special privileges, the granting of corporate charters, was an engine, or at least a potential engine, of systematic corruption. And the specter of this systematic corruption helped persuade a critical mass of the American colonists that to maintain their freedoms, they had to, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, dissolve the political bands which had connected them to another and to alter their former systems of government. While, of course, ultimately successful, the Revolutionary War turned out to be long, expensive, and highly damaging to the American economy. America went into a depression in the 1780s, and its national government was in arrears in much of the massive debt it had incurred to win the nation's independence. State governments, which had also borrowed very heavily, were also suffering from various degrees of financial distress. And Americans were struggling with very hard questions of constitutional design, for the inadequacies of its national governance document, the so-called Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. I love that title. They were completed in 1777, and they were finally declared to be the law of the land in 1781. There was a unanimity requirement. All the states had to agree for the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union to go into effect. So Maryland, the final state to assent, acquiesced in 1781, but then things were not going well. Yes, we won the Battle of Yorktown. Yes, we concluded the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and it was reasonably favorable to us. But we were a nation strung out along the Atlantic seaboard, surrounded by three large, rapacious European empires who didn't wish us well. And the states were riven by all kinds of quarrels amongst themselves. And the Articles of Confederation had glaring problems, more apparent with each passing week, it seemed. The lack of reliable sources of funds for the national government. The national government had to beg the states for money, in effect, and the states would often just say, go pound sand. The inability of the central government to constrain the individual states from engaging in economic warfare with one another. Without a true national economy, it was hard to see how we would continue to be such a prosperous society. It was even hard to see how we would continue to be a nation surrounded by these three European empires, which were still quite interested in expanding their territories in the Americas, particularly North America. So what was to be done? The answer was a constitutional convention held in Philadelphia from May to September in 1787. Initially entrusted with addressing weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation regime, the Philadelphia Convention went rogue, or at least that's what its critics said, and brought to the people, an entirely new constitution, entirely new document that was to be submitted to the individual states for approval, submitted to conventions in the individual states for approval, with the stipulation that the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this constitution, between the states so ratifying the same. Now, it is often argued, or sometimes argued, that the strongest impetus for the 1787 Constitutional Convention and its resultant product of an entirely new constitution was fear of excessive democracy. And not just fear of excessive democracy, but fear of excessive democracy that threatened the wealth and power of those at the top. That is one of the principal arguments that I hear these days to criticizing our Constitution and suggesting that maybe our Constitution's roots are not actually so legitimate because they were, in effect, engaged in what my friend and former colleague, now Harvard Law professor Michael Klarman, calls the framers' coup. In his book, The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution, Mike stresses that the nation's elites, a group that, of course, comprised our most high-profile founders, including James Madison, were deeply alarmed by what they regarded as the excesses of the state legislatures, particularly when it came to debt relief measures and the issuance of paper money. Professor Klarman and others have argued, and so far as this goes, they are correct in my judgment, that securing the stability of property and contract rights was a key motivation of the Philadelphia Convention's supporters and participants. And these efforts to safeguard property and contract rights were, I believe, on the whole successful, particularly when the Fifth Amendment was added to the Constitution as part of the first 10 amendments that came very shortly after ratification. The best interpretation of the United States Constitution is that it does operate as a bulwark, protecting property and contract rights from, among other things, the rapid redistribution of the wealth of private individuals and firms. At the same time, I am deeply skeptical that it was fears of excess democracy, together with the drive to solidify their own wealth, status, social position, and so forth, that was the major, or even a strong, motivation. The evidence, in my eyes anyway, is just too strong that the framers of our Constitution were engaged not in a coup to seize power from the people who were engaging in excess democracy, but in the difficult project of long-term institutional design to achieve the core goal of the American Revolution, to break free from what they saw as an incipient tyranny of oligarchy and corruption. For one thing, corruption and its perils are front and center in the records of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. James Madison's notes from the convention contain numerous, over 50 references to corruption and its hazards, and Madison's own writings express strong disapproval of what we today tend to call crony capitalism, illustrating that although Madison was, of course, highly attuned to the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, he certainly thought that a lot of the debt relief measures were undermining contract rights, and he certainly did not thought paper money, understood that paper money could be extremely dangerous, extremely inflationary. But he knew, in the words of Camilla Vergara in her book Systematic Corruption, Constitutional Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic, Madison knew corruption could also come from the elites who are supposed to protect liberty. It is also important to note that the text of the Constitution has numerous anti-corruption provisions. Not explicitly, you won't find corruption banned in the Constitution, but what we do see is a constitutional structure that divides the power of the national government among the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, and further divides the legislative power between the Senate and the House of Representatives, in effect setting up multiple veto points for anything to be enacted. Some call our Constitution sclerotic. I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact is it is designed to have multiple veto points, which inhibits corruption, because in order to carry out a kind of heist, if you are disposed to, you can't just get control of one part of our national government. You have to, in effect, deal with the problem that there are multiple parts of the government. In addition, because the Constitution provides for a federal government of limited powers, It ensures that government power is divided between the federal government on the one hand, which has specific powers. It is a strong federal government. It has always been a strong federal government. But the states have also been strong governments. It is the individual state governments that retain the core police powers of ensuring public health and safety. It is true that the Constitution explicitly allows for monopolies. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 explicitly states that the Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. This was a clause, an idea that was very much supported by Madison, who said that while monopolies cause a lot of mischief, he was, on balance, anti-monopoly, they were not all bad. Not all exclusive rights are bad, because they can, of course, be spurs to innovation, just as patents and copyrights are. But note that they are limited in time. And of course, some of the special privileges given were meant to spur investment in infrastructure. Again, no one affiliated, or very few people involved in the crafting of the Constitution, wanted to do away with them altogether. They just understood the complex problems of their dangers. As ratified then, the new Constitution operated to constrain, although it did not extirpate, systemic corruption. Post-ratification, there were, of course, serious disagreements about what precisely constituted systematic corruption. The Bank of the United States controversy, which raged for decades, was one of the most high-profile examples of this fight. Alexander Hamilton spearheaded a Bank of the United States, which would be 20% owned by the national government. It will be great. It will, in effect, make commerce easier. But the detractors, who included Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, said this is corruption. This is exactly the kind of thing we fought a revolution to get away from. This is a promise by the national government that the Bank of the United States won't have any competitors for 20 years. Sure, it might grease the wheels of the financial world and the commercial world, but at way, way, way too great a potential cost. In any event, the first bank was established. It had a 20-year term, but in 1811, when its term was up, it wasn't renewed. Then the United States fought the War of 1812. It turned out to be difficult to fight the war. There were some who thought that maybe if we had the Bank of the United States, it would have gone a little better. And so from 1816 to 1836, we had the second Bank of the United States. But again, the controversies raged about whether or not this was a vehicle for corruption. Opponents of the bank said this restricts opportunities for lucrative activities to a chosen establishment few. Andrew Jackson's veto message of 1832, where he said, no, I will not sign a bill to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, and he tells us why. He tells us, in effect, that he is opposed to, not that he uses the term, crony capitalism, and that crony capitalism can destroy our nation. It is incompatible, he writes, with the Constitution to just give away monopolies and exclusive privileges. The people should get some kind of value for these special privileges. It is to be regretted, moreover, writes Jackson, that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man, he wasn't thinking a lot about women, but he does think about every man. He is a strong Democrat by the standards of the early 19th century. Every man is equally entitled to the protection by law. But where the laws undertake to add to those natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, such as exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer, writes Jackson, and the potent more powerful, then the humbler members of society who can't compete in this struggle to secure government favoritism have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. Jackson's vision of what America should be was, in essence, a semi-open access society. I say not quite an open access society because there was slavery, of course, still, and Jackson, though he understood that a lot of women were agitating by 1830s, 1840s, remember the Seneca Falls Convention occurs in 1848, A lot of women are agitating for expanded opportunities in the professions, expanded opportunities to manage their own property if they're married women, the right to their own earnings if they're married women. That is not as interesting to Jackson. But Jackson is very much of a piece with other things that are going on, because his arguments, his grave unhappiness, that achievement and rank may not be achievable simply from identifying and developing one's own talents and working very hard, that a world of special privileges is one where access to a decent life may require becoming a minion of some kind of aristocrat. Jackson hates that, and so do a lot of others around that time. It is in the mid-19th century that we see systemic corruption in the United States, not destroyed, not ended, but I would argue tamed. It is in the mid-19th century that we see, in effect, concerns about systemic corruption die down. Now, it boils up every once in a while, but from, roughly speaking, the mid-19th century to the turn of the 21st century, systemic corruption does not look like such a terrible problem. 5 years after Jackson's 1832 veto message, the Supreme Court decides the Charles River Bridge v. Warren Bridge case. It narrowly construes a government grant of a right to the Charles River Bridge Company to build a bridge across the Charles River. It doesn't say that the Charles River Bridge Company has no rights. It does, but it doesn't have nearly the rights that the Charles River Bridge Company argues that it bindingly contracted to get from the government. Charles River Bridge thought what we got was pretty much a perpetual right to an exclusive privilege to maintain the only bridge in the area, in other words, to be free from competition. And the Supreme Court says, no, that is not what you got. You were not given some kind of right to be free from any competition. You were given a very limited right, and we construe the grant of special privilege from the government narrowly, because in interpreting the Constitution, we must read these narrowly, because monopolies were disfavored, writes Justice Taney. Monopolies were disfavored, and thus these special grants must be construed narrowly. And perhaps most important for purposes of understanding the taming of systematic corruption, the individual states in the 19th century, through state constitutional provisions, through statutes and so forth, in effect adopt rules of general incorporation. No more need to go to the legislature and get your special corporate charter. You have rights, everyone has rights, to simply set up a corporation which will have all the benefits, limited liability and so forth, the standard corporate rules, etc. That is not to say that just anyone can set up a corporation for anything. There were rules about the purposes for which corporations could be established, etc., etc., etc. It was not nearly as lax, or nearly, I should say, as broad in terms of giving those who set up corporations latitude to do as they pleased, as I would argue our present day corporate law system. But compared to a world of special corporate charters, laws of general incorporation were, in effect, a seismic modification. The beneficiaries were for-profits, especially those of not well politically connected entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs tend to be constructive to society. They do not tend to be trying to loot. They tend to be trying to build something because they are entrepreneurs, because they are, in effect, trying to make a success of a for-profit company. They must persuade people to deal with them willingly. They can't coerce people to be their customers. They have to actually compete and offer a good product. Other beneficiaries of general incorporation statutes, nonprofits, including churches. There were massive fights about establishment of religion. If governments granted churches, any church, any kind of special charter, there would be arguments that that a church was being established. Founding generation was very suspicious of the establishment of religion. It's not to say they were suspicious of religion, they weren't, but they were suspicious of, in effect, the dominance of a particular sect. So we see a lot of nonprofits, including churches, benefiting from this general incorporation regime, And that adds to the associations of the sort that de Tocqueville celebrated in Democracy in America. In addition, in the 19th century, courts began handing down decisions in accord with these principles of equal treatment. Laws, courts insisted, must be general, not directed at benefiting a particular class. The idea that laws should be general for the common good and not so-called class legislation was one that remained powerful in the United States until the 20th century. It had then, of course, it has faded away since then. And perhaps when we think about what to do about our present predicament, it is certainly on my list of ideas that might be given something of a revival. Concerns about corruption flared up again in the Gilded Age after the Civil War. Most of these concerns about corruption that we see in the Gilded Age are concerns about venal corruption, concerns about flat-out bribery, concerns about property, valuable property being, in effect, conveyed to powerful special interests for non-fair, at non-market prices, and so forth. The concerns of the Gilded Age are rarely those of systemic corruption. All right, so what happens? Why is it that at the turn of the 21st century, looking at the rhetoric in particular of the populist movements I referred to a few minutes ago, why did I begin seeing rhetoric that reminded me a lot of the rhetoric of the Revolutionary War era, the early national period in the United States, and then the early 19th century? Well, government certainly did grow. The United States became an increasingly powerful nation, an increasingly complex nation. Technological innovations allowed for much faster communication, much faster transportation, and so forth. So we end up with more and more federal government agencies. State governments are also growing. There is concern about monopoly, as always, and that leads to the formation of the Federal Trade Commission. Concerns about venal corruption lead to civil service reform and increase in the civil service. We see additional increases in government in the New Deal era. Those increases are not entirely uncontroversial, but by and large, in assessing the performance of the government entities created in the New Deal era, systemic corruption, or even venal corruption, is not considered to be a big problem. These expansions of government might be a bad idea. They might be unnecessary. They might even be the sort of thing that drags down the economy, slowing down recovery from the Great Depression. Many in the 1930s and since the 1930s have argued exactly that, and it's plausible. It could be true. But it wasn't that the thought was that in expanding the government in the New Deal era, the United States was becoming corrupt. The government also, of course, expanded in World War II and remained strong, particularly the military-industrial parts of it, remained strong during the Cold War. Again, though, this is a time of enormous trust in government and other institutions. But there are some clouds that begin to gather. Dwight David Eisenhower, when he leaves the presidency, warns about the military-industrial complex, warns that this is an entity that has its own interests, its own agenda, and it may not be overlapping with the common good. In the 1960s, there is controversy about the Vietnam War. Part of that controversy is rooted in suspicion, distrust of this military-industrial complex. It has all these incentives to, in effect, get us into wars that we cannot win. Wars where our incentives, our goals are not strong, are not easy to articulate. How is that going to go well? It isn't. In the 1970s, government looks increasingly incompetent. It's not just that the Vietnam War turned out badly, although of course it did. It's also that inflation comes, and the government doesn't seem to understand why it's coming and doesn't know what to do about it. Eventually, it is tamed, but it takes a very, very long time. And the ineffectiveness of the government begins to add to increasing concerns that government agencies that are supposed to be overseeing particular sectors of the economy are actually, if not obviously in the pockets of those regulated entities, they are a bit confused. They don't quite know how to separate out the common good from the interests of those they are supposed to be regulating. But the 1980s and 1990s seem to be a good period for America. The Cold War is won, and we get a peace dividend, and history has, we are told, achieved its purpose of effectuating liberal democracy. So why is it that we run into problems? What is it that occurs at the turn of the 21st century? I think there are two things that come to the fore, beginning in the early years of this century. The first is that government appears to be often ineffective. As NYU law professor Rick Pildes has put it in a, I think, very important recent paper, The Neglected Value of Effective Government, a lot of the process values that resulted in more government transparency, more government process, et cetera, did make government less able to do things. And as a result, government began to look less capable. But my big concern is with the second problem that comes up in the early 21st century, that government appears to have less of a fiduciary mindset. Now, government is not the only entity that appears to be losing its fiduciary mindset. I promise not to harp on higher education too much, though as you can tell, I'm a bit annoyed at some of the recent developments. But I would say higher education, the health sector, healthcare sector, and so forth, we seem to be surrounded by institutions that once had more of a fiduciary mindset, and somehow along the way it somehow got degraded. Government action, especially in the context of crises or so-called crises, all too frequently sets out to do things that appear not to be consonant with or may even be inimical to the common good. So how do we address this? I have no magic potion, but I do have some suggestions. And one of my suggestions, and I think it merits consideration, is that we impose a variant of what I think of as overarching concept originalism. That is, I think that to be faithful to the Constitution, it makes sense to keep in mind the overarching goals, overarching organizing principles that motivated the Constitution, that led to its ratification, and that have stood us in good stead. Although the anti-systemic corruption principle faded from view because the problem was addressed and if not solved completely, at least ameliorated, I think that aspect of our constitutional tradition got forgotten. Other aspects, other so-called overarching concepts, or what I call overarching concepts of our constitutional tradition were not forgotten. Freedom, of course. And so, but systemic corruption, I think, did go by the wayside, and it would be a good idea, I think, to revive it. When trying to figure out what the Constitution means, it is common, no matter what methodologies people purport to embrace, common to keep in mind the meaning of freedom. And as we keep in mind the concerns and aspirations that inspired and motivated our Constitution, I think those aspirations include, in fact, very close to the top of the list, is the taming of systematic corruption. If we wish to fulfill the promise of the Constitution and of the Declaration of Independence, the promise of an opportunity society, one where people will be able to participate fully, and of course we have little by little expanded the franchise, expanded those who in effect are able to be full participants in society, I think the anti-corruption principle may help us. Now, I do realize that many originalists, many self-identified originalists, will likely recoil at my suggestion because to them it is an invitation to mischief. They will argue this approach can lead to unrestrained, out-of-control courts, and that means that we will have courts who will be, in effect, doing whatever they please. Sure, they will cherry-pick historical sources according to ideology or just to whim. That is exactly the sort of stuff that originalists, if I may use that phrase, those who were at the vanguard of the originalist movement, pushed back hard against. They wanted to stop this. They saw the Warren courts, the Burger court too, to some extent, as being, in effect, if not lawless, at least as being unrestrained, and strict interpretations of the Constitution, according to its original public meaning, or so the argument goes, that focus on the text. Not all originalists believe we should focus on the text so strongly, but many do. That's necessary to keep institutions from getting out of their lane. Now, that's fair enough, but before dismissing this idea out of hand, I think we should at least consider the upside. First, even if originalism as a movement was to a significant degree originally inspired by concerns that courts were out of hand, it doesn't mean that we need to keep that obsession now. That is, I look at originalism and its methodologies as ways to, in effect, keep the various parts of our government in their lanes. They have particular talents, they have particular jobs under the Constitution, and if one gets too worried about one particular entity being unconstrained, I think that can lead to an unbalanced Constitution. Most importantly, I think keeping systemic corruption in mind gets us closer to the vision of the founding generation. If we wish to be faithful to the Constitution, if we wish to, in effect, carry forward this extraordinarily successful project, our Constitution being, by most measures, the oldest one in the world now, this is an incredible achievement. And if we wish to, in essence, continue it, it makes sense to understand what it is that we have been entrusted to continue. And it will open up the constitutional conversation. There is a danger that originalist methods can serve, and other methods of interpretation too, they can serve to narrow the set of individuals who are able to take part in constitutional discussions. Constitutional debate should not just be for specialists. Of course, some constitutional questions will be very technical in nature, and I've certainly participated in my share of those discussions. Some turn on the meaning of precise legal terms in the Constitution. What did they mean to legal audiences? What did they mean to lay audiences back in the 1780s? So I'm not suggesting we get rid of that kind of constitutional debate, but I am suggesting that it would be a good thing to have broader participation. Would this make a difference, you may ask? I say, I think so, or at least a bit on the margin. And so in illustrating how, in effect, understanding of the problem of systemic corruption, understanding that there is at least some solid evidence that the United States is once again facing the specter of systemic corruption, I think that it would make modifications to constitutional interpretation, at least a little bit at the margin. So let me give just a few examples, and then I will wrap up, because I did, as I say, promise to leave time for questions and comments. First, the social media companies and their censorship, or if you want to say that private companies don't engage in censorship, only government engages in censorship, their moderation of content, including during the COVID-19 epidemic. Now, as mentioned, I'm on the board of advisors of the new Civil Liberties Alliance, which has been very much involved in these efforts to find out what the government did to encourage and to perhaps rein and to try to stop it. This, right now, is in the hands of the courts, and we are learning more every day. And of course, there are First Amendment concerns when government works through private entities. Government cannot do indirectly what it can't do directly when it comes to censorship. However, in trying to figure out what to do about this, I think an understanding of the dangers of systemic corruption could be extremely illuminating. Because the kind of systemic corruption, at least from my perspective, that we see with government strongly encouraging the muffling of information, is one that, in effect, threatens to make the scientific community a limited access community. In effect, there was shutting up of people who were experts, who knew a lot, who were simply dissenting from the common wisdom. And that, to me, is one of the most dangerous examples of systemic corruption that I can imagine. Next example, the administrative state. Yes, we have a huge administrative state. We don't expect Congress to pass laws that specify every single little detail, so a lot is entrusted to agencies who make a lot of judgment calls. And we want, or at least most people want, to have experts who will be entrusted in making the kinds of decisions that experts need to make. But as we have more and more and more rules, many of which seem to be unworkable, many of which seem to be anti-competitive, maybe anti-competitive because the agencies have been captured or at least strongly influenced by existing large players in the industry. Maybe they are, in effect, not working because the people working in the agencies are kind of not paying a lot of attention and just making up a bunch of rules and thinking, this sounds pretty good, let's do it. And then someone says, but wait a minute, we're going to go out of business if we have to do this. You want a government inspector to come along on a commercial fishing operation, and then the company has to pay for it. Well, they can't make a living if they have to do that, and so forth. I think the understanding that a society that becomes a limited access society, ones where there are high barriers to participating in lawful occupations, is one in which systemic corruption either is a problem or is likely soon to be a problem. Another example, occupational licensing. One might characterize or classify occupational licensing as part of the administrative state. I discuss it separately because unlike the administrative state, which has both federal government and state government components, usually when people talk about the administrative state, though, they mean the federal government, occupational licensing restrictions are usually creatures of state law. They have exploded in recent decades. The number of workers who need to have a license in order to engage in things like, not just the obvious like medicine, but things like flower arranging. I'm not kidding, interior decor, and so on. This sounds silly, except that it's not silly if people find it very difficult, very expensive, very time-consuming to redeploy their abilities to enter a new field. And it's very, very hard on those who move from one state to another. The brunt of this falls, I believe, or at least there's some evidence to suggest it falls a bit heavily on women. Women are more likely to be following spouses and so caught up by the disadvantages of this occupational licensing scheme. If one looks at occupational licensing laws through the lens of a constitution that was designed in part to ensure occupational opportunities, these laws look much less good from a constitutional perspective. And with occupational licensing, I think this is especially important because to date, constitutional challenges to occupational licensing have been ineffective. One big reason they have been ineffective is that it is not easy, in fact, it's impossible to point to a specific textual provision when arguing that occupational licensing is unconstitutional. Now, that is not necessarily fatal to constitutional arguments. After all, one can't point to a specific part of the Constitution, or it's not an obvious one, with respect to things like the right to travel. So there is plenty that has been found, discerned in the Constitution by those who interpret it, where we don't have explicit text. Nevertheless, it has been a problem for those who have asked courts to take a careful look at occupational licensing regimes. Final example is that of campaign finance regulation. Most of the literature on campaign finance regulation focuses on venal corruption. The specter that someone will give a politician, someone running for office, a big gift and they'll get a quid pro quo. But that's not the only kind of corruption, of course. And in trying to stop venal corruption, putting limitations on donations that various entities can give, trying to shut down the ability of organizations, including nonprofit corporations, to give money, to have the freedom to give money and things like that. Yeah, venal corruption could be a problem, but on the other hand, We have systemic corruption, and systemic corruption, I would argue, anyway, can result when rules become so complicated that only insiders can comply with them. It's very hard to run true populist, outsider, insurgent campaigns these days because the laws, the regulations are just so complicated. So easy it would be. In fact, I think it would be pretty much impossible not to, at some point, engage in some kind of violation. And so these campaign finance reforms that are aimed at stopping venal corruption, it seems to me, may instead be fueling systemic corruption, limiting opportunity to participate in political life as a candidate for office, as a public official, to insiders who have better access to the knowledge of what the rules are and the knowledge of how governments, Federal Election Commission, and prosecutors and so forth are going to interpret those rules. All right, finally, I will wrap up. I will argue that to restore public trust in American institutions and to ensure that the United States fulfills the promise of the American Revolution as a flourishing society with opportunity for all, or we hope all, I think that will take work. I think it will take courts, federal and state, that will continue their work of constitutional interpretation and construction, and I hope they will continue this with keeping in mind the formidable problems of systemic corruption that loomed so large in the founding era, then declined, and now have come up again. It will take, I think, the legislatures being thoughtful about their constitutional roles and duties. Courts are not, of course, the only constitutional actors. Legislatures have take oaths to the Constitution after all and should understand that they are supposed to be promoting the general welfare. Executives, the president, and governors need to, I think, be more cognizant of the limits of their powers, particularly in times of emergency. And I think that it will take all of us, because I think that the success of the United States requires, and has always required, continued commitment on the part of each generation. In undertaking this project, I think we can take inspiration from James Madison, who remained, until his death in 1836, optimistic about the Constitution. Many of his generation, maybe even most, of those who were part of this incredible enterprise of crafting the United States Constitution were not nearly as optimistic as Madison. In fact, quite a few were downright gloomy. Dennis Rasmussen, in his book, Fears of a Setting Sun, The Disillusionment of America's Founders, recounts just how many were really, really, really depressed about the Constitution's future, and even the future of the United States. George Washington dies in 1799, and he's pretty unhappy. He's not completely pessimistic, but he had not expected to see the bitterly partisan political parties that emerged in the 1790s. He found it discouraging. Thomas Jefferson, who dies in 1826, just a few miles from where I live and work, up at Monticello, last years of his life, he sees the growing sectional problems. He sees that things between the North and the South could be really bad. He sees that slavery is not a problem that is being solved. But Madison, who was just up the road in Orange County, Madison remained sanguine about the Constitution. All right, why? Why does Madison get it right? And of course, James Madison gets it right, and extraordinarily gets it right a lot of the time. He has an absolutely incredible record, not that everything he thought was right, but he's sanguine about the Constitution, and I think there are two principal reasons. First, Madison is not thrown off his game by bitter partisanship. He doesn't necessarily like it, but he doesn't conclude that things are going to hell just because people are being nasty to one another. He's able to shrug it off. I think a lot of people in the United States in 2024 who came of age at a time of more decorous politics, when Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. socialized in a fairly pleasant way, I think a lot of the bitterness has come as a shock. And I'm concerned that people might be overreacting. Not again that I like it, but I think Madison sets an excellent example in accepting it and working with it. And the second reason that I believe Madison saw so far is that he always asked, compared to what? What's our alternative? A keen student of history, he knew full well by the end of his life in 1836, he'd spent a lot of the final years of his life going over his notes, getting them in shape, and so forth. He was always asking, compared to what? He knew that compared to the rest of the world, which has been, unfortunately, ridden with more corruption than the United States has seen, that the United States of America had achieved something extraordinary. So with that, I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
All right, we have a tradition in the Madison program of allowing students to ask the first questions. So are there any students in the room who might like to pose a question to Professor Mahoney? Going once. All right, well, let's open it up more generally. Yes, sir, please.
One of the institutions in which public confidence has declined markedly is the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you think the recent decision about presidential immunity opens the door to corruption?
Not exactly. I think the Supreme Court has fallen, no question about it, in public trust. It's fallen less than other parts of the government, right? So the Supreme Court, if we grade it on a curve, is doing fairly well. I think the immunity decision is best understood as an effort to make it hard for a new administration to engage in lawfare toward the old administration. Reading between the lines of the Supreme Court's decision, it seems to me that it is a message, conveys a powerful message. Don't even try, Donald Trump, if you are reelected, to go after the Biden administration. So it seems to me, now you might say that can open up things to bad acts, to perhaps all kinds of very, well, corrupt, in the venally corrupt way, sense with foreign, we've had serious accusations, right, about dealings with foreign governments and so on. So I think that is the possible flip side. But I read the Supreme Court's immunity decision as an effort to greatly discourage the harnessing of the legal system in order to go after political opponents.
Yes, sir.
I have two, actually. How might Justice Scalia feel about the Supreme Court's decision, since Justice Scalia was an originalist, and there's not a lot in the Constitution that would sort of just jump out and say, you know, presidential immunity exists. And my second question is, suppose a factory is producing waste and dumping it into the community. Government that's a negative externality, and government has a responsibility to regulate that and block that. Isn't it an analogous case if someone is, you know, using social media to dispense disinformation that's toxic to the society, and disinformation of the pandemic could possibly fit that bill? Doesn't government have a responsibility to respond to that too?
So, first question about Justice Scalia and immunity. Justice Scalia interpreted the Constitution against background principles. And a very important background principle is that of immunity of various sorts. So I don't know where he would have come out. My guess is that he probably would have been in accord with at least some portions of the Chief Justice's opinion. So that would certainly be consonant with other decisions of his that I've read. As for the analogy of toxic waste and people speaking, I would say that's not a very satisfactory analogy. That we certainly limit speech that is toxic in the sense that people can be sued for slander and libel. not all speech is protected, right? There are certainly threats and so forth that do not receive protection, and that's where we've drawn the line. You might want to draw the line at a different place, but I think you would probably need more than a rough analogy between toxicity of substances that can damage physical health and toxicity of speech that can incite bad conduct. So you might want to think more about exactly where it is that you're going to draw the line.
Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you. Well, first I have to thank you, Professor Mahoney, for returning me to Mike Klarman's 1991 American Legal History class, where I remember him making that argument. I wanted to ask, well, two things really, kind of related to the questions that have just been asked. In the realm of regulatory capture and the administrative state, how do you see Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, the case overturning or abandoning Chevron deference? Is it a move in the right direction by the Supreme Court to sort of get at the root of the type of systemic corruption you're talking about, or to at least allow others to? And then on the question of speech and moderation of content, is there an argument that, in fact, particularly with regard to science, allowing refutation to proceed is more likely to avoid a situation where one side or the other captures the debate?
So as to Loper Bright and the overruling of Chevron deference, I think that was inevitable. The Supreme Court had not, in fact, been using Chevron very much. And there had been a complex relationship whereby when agencies believed that they were going to get significant deference from courts, agencies, at least in the eyes of many, became more aggressive about their interpretations of statutes. And so I think I would look at the recent actions of the court as kind of part of an ongoing effort to kind of balance the relationship between courts and agencies. That if there's a huge amount of deference and the agencies begin to get fairly aggressive, it makes sense that the deference will be cut back a little bit. We don't know, of course, right now exactly how this is going to play out in the lower courts. It is entirely plausible that this, quote, end of Chevron is not going to change things all that much. After all, we may just return to where we were before Chevron. And Chevron, as you know, when decided in 1984, was not obviously a seismic case at the time. It was no Roe v. Wade. It didn't attract a lot of attention because Chevron, at least most interpretations and most readings of Chevron, back in 1984, it seemed to be really much more of just a summary of the court's previous decisions, summary of the history, not striking out in a new direction. What I think made people slowly be convinced that there needed to be some kind of change was the concern that agencies were getting more aggressive. So from one perspective, this most recent development might actually be bringing us back to where we were when Chevron was decided in 1984.
And then on the question of science, so during the COVID crisis, there was an administrative view widely articulated by, for example, Dr. Fauci and others about the efficacy of vaccines, the need to get them, and where to get them, and which treatments were and were not appropriate, picked up in social media. And then, of course, the controversy is about whether or not companies were pressured to take one line or the other. And I think what seems lacking to me, and I wonder what you think about this in an argument about toxicity, is that by removing scientific refutation from the argument, the bond between the administrative in that case, NIH and other agencies, and those whose interest is to promote one particular type of treatment or vaccine or approach to a worldwide pandemic goes uncountered. And so it seems to me that the argument is the argument would weigh against that kind of forced moderation from a scientific point of view.
I think it was a bad idea for them to engage in forced moderation. If they were going to, in particular, force taking down of purported information. If there was going to be any kind of pressure, I believe it should be limited to putting things in context. Even there, I think, they're a grave danger, particularly in an area where very little is known and information is moving very fast, that one will get it wrong. And of course, errors, and there have been a lot of errors, will further corrode public trust. The recent figures of the levels of trust in medicine and science are, to me, truly horrifying. And as with higher education, I think these sectors of the economy did it to themselves to a large degree. Now, many people who were engaged in efforts to stifle debate, to, in effect, make sure that the medical and scientific communities, together with, of course, the parts of the government that work with them, spoke with one voice, I think many people did have good intentions in the sense that they thought that they would, in effect, discourage the public or help prevent the public from panicking and so on, that they would, in effect, get better compliance and so forth, that sure, their advice wasn't going to be perfect, but it was going to be pretty good, and on and on and on. But those are the sorts of things that it's very easy to persuade oneself of, especially if one has been making pronouncements, as people in medicine, science, government were during the COVID-19 pandemic, making pronouncements based on very, very, very little knowledge, and then immediately being very unhappy when there is pushback. We saw that again and again and again, and the upshot was that many in government spent more time trying to quell public questions, public debate, additional narratives, than they did actually doing what I consider to be their core job. I think it was a very bad development, and it gained a momentum of its own, and now we are at a point where we can sort through what happened and figure out what government was encouraging various social media and other corporate entities to do, and at least reach a preliminary assessment of how much damage it did. I think we can say almost for certain at this point, though, that it has done a fair bit of damage to the already creaky reputations of science and medicine. And that, I think, is very bad, and I would like very much to try to repair that.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the idea of corruption. So as it seems to me, in the classic sense, in the early American founding sense, corruption is referring to a kind of class interest. So the Jacksonian Democrats are always talking about the moneyed class gaining corruption through the national bank. And the language of regulatory capture is originally something similar. The corporations are making use of their regulators to serve a kind of class interest. The phenomenon you're describing, especially with the case of the social media companies, it isn't a class interest kind of corruption. It's a kind of ideological capture, which is, a play from regulatory capture. So I'm wondering if there is an earlier history of in American thinking about corruption that deals with ideological corruption, if you're comfortable with that description, and how it might differ from class-based corruption.
I like that description. I think it's partially class-based. So it's absolutely true that some of the wars that we see when it comes to systemic corruption are rich versus rich, absolutely. So we see a lot of, and we see a lot of redistribution up too. We see the rich, in effect, waging war on the poor. Here, I would say, you're right. There's ideology, but most of those trying to stifle debate are, on the social scale, above those who are being stifled. Sometimes it's distinguished epidemiologist versus Fauci, and so on. But a lot of times, it's people who are ordinary doctors, family medicine practitioners. I saw plenty of posts from people who are physician's assistants, nurses, or just people who happen to have some knowledge of some aspect of science and medicine, and so on. And they were, in effect, pushed down hard. And to me, it is a class thing. Maybe not as much of an economic class thing, but certainly in a society where prestige comes not just from money, but also from things like, well, Princeton degrees, for example. It seems to me that this is a kind of class warfare. Now, a lot of it's the fight, you might say, a lot of it's fights between the top 1% and the top 10%. I mean, that's true. The 0.01% and so forth versus the 0.001%, absolutely. But yeah, I would say that these still seem to me, at least, to have a lot of elements of class warfare. I would say any time that there is a actual or potential elite, in effect, solidifying its position by beating up on, limiting the ability of others to compete with them, question them, and so on, I would say there's an element of class warfare, an attempt to dominate, right? Thinking back to the founding era, so a lot of the rhetoric is about how we want to escape from domination. You don't want to be in a society where, in effect, you have to pay homage to someone, so the arguments would go, in order to flourish. You want to be able to go out there and, in effect, be your best self.
One more young person. Yeah.
I have a question about the monetary powers that the Constitution vests to Congress. So I think, if I understand correctly, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of the Constitution gives to Congress the power to issue currency and regulate the value. But if we look at the monetary aggregates of the money supply in US dollars today, only about like 5% of what is considered as money is issued by the Federal Reserve, which is arguably a federal agency, or it's kind of a hybrid agency. But like 95% of the money supply is in the form of bank deposits and credit deposits that are created by commercial banks. So my question, by crediting and debiting their balance sheets. So my question would be, do you see when it comes to how the founders thought about monetary power and how that was connected to sovereignty and vesting it to Congress, do you think the way that money is issued today poses some kind of risks for systemic corruption? And what is your view, like how the monetary system, you've touched upon the national banks and the Federal Reserve, so I'm wondering, in that broad sense, what do you think about how the monetary system works and the banking system?
Well, yes, I think there are risks of systemic corruption, and I think it is important to look very carefully at the constitutionality of all entities, and that would include the Federal Reserve. So I think that arguments that the Federal Reserve has some constitutional infirmities are maybe not terribly convincing, but they're not completely implausible. So this is an area where there hasn't been a lot of work done yet. I hope there'll be more work done, because I think you've raised important and interesting questions. So thank you.
We unfortunately have to conclude. It is 6 o'clock. So thank you all for coming. Join me in thanking Professor Mahoney.